Once we've got these objects created, we can impose rules on these objects. And this is where virtual machine storage policies come into play. This tells ESXi a little bit about what we as vSphere administrators need in terms of these vSAN objects. Think about a virtual machine that's running a database, and this is a high-performance database. Now you need some performance out of this thing. You need 2,000 or 3,000 IOPS out of this database. You also need a minimum amount of capacity. I need 2 terabytes of disk space. You also need, for this virtual machine, to be able to survive the failure of an ESXi host. So we can do that with vSphere HA. Virtual machine fails, we just power it on another ESXi host, or the ESXi host fails, we find another ESXi host to run the virtual machine. But what if the virtual machine files themselves were only located on a host that had failed? Well, a virtual machine storage policy can say, hey, we need another copy of those virtual machine files so that we can simply switch to another ESXi host where the virtual machine data will actually be. So all of these rules that we would like to impose on vSAN and on ESXi in order to support the virtual machines as we need them supported are done with virtual machine storage policies. Okay? These storage policies are based on the capabilities of the storage array itself. Now we can have storage policies for external storage, but we can also have it for vSAN like we're talking about here. When we build a virtual machine, by default, all of the virtual machine files and all of the virtual disks get the same policy. But if we wanted to, we could have separate policies for each of the virtual machine disks, or the VMDKs, within a single VM. You can apply those policies and change those policies anytime you like. And for example, I start a virtual machine with no redundancy. Consider it RAID 0, if you will. Meaning I've got a virtual machine running on a host over here, and the storage is on a host over here, and there's only one copy of those virtual machine files. Well, now I want to put that virtual machine into production, and my production SLA says I have to be able to support the failure of a host. And if the virtual machine files are over here and this host fails, then this VM goes down, right? Well, I can change the policy to say I need to support at least one host failure. As soon as I change the policy, vSAN will create a replica of those virtual machine files on another ESXi host. This way, if this ESXi host should fail, then the virtual machine will simply start using the files on another host, automatically, without a failure of the VM itself. I also have policies that allow us to enable things like RAID 5 and RAID 6 base parity. I can do RAID 0 striping across multiple ESXi hosts to improve performance. Okay? So these storage policies are extremely useful to us, and it allows us as vSphere administrators to take back control of the virtual machine in terms of the way it lives, runs, and performs on storage. The way that we can change those virtual machine policies is by editing the settings of the virtual machine. Right-click on any VM and select Edit Settings. Pull down the hard disk link here, and you can see the virtual machine storage policy. And there is a default vSAN storage policy, which says that I am going to have one replica of each of the virtual machine files. Think of that like a RAID 1 mirror, okay? And it even says RAID 1, you know, and it'll choose one host failure to tolerate. All right, so I'll have 2 copies of each of the virtual machine disks. What it says here is I've got a 768 megabyte hard drive. I've got a vSAN storage data store that has almost 57 gigs of disk space. And by using the default policy, I'm going to actually utilize double the capacity. Not necessarily 768 times 2 because it's thin provisioned, don't forget. But if, for example, I was using 500 megabytes out of that 768, each of those that VMDK file will exist on 2 ESXi hosts or more, and you can choose at the same time. You'll also notice the location of that virtual machine file in terms of, hey, it's on the vSAN data store, and here is the unique identifier of that vSAN data store. There's a folder for this virtual machine called photon-03, and there's the VMDK file itself. So it's very familiar and easy to understand how it works. Well, this is not a vSAN class, but we did definitely want you to get a little bit of a taste of vSAN. And if you're interested in vSAN, VMware Education actually has a vSAN deploy and manage course that's 3 days. We also have a vSAN troubleshooting class. If you really wanted to dive deep into this technology, we encourage you to do it. Now, in your lab environment, we actually have a vSAN cluster and a vSAN data store that's been created. So, and there's some virtual machine files on there. So we're actually just going to examine these virtual machine files and the vSAN data store and see what it all looks like to us. Okay? And then we'll move on here. So I hope you get a good understanding of what hyperconverged storage and in particular VMware's vSAN can do for you in your environment. You have a little bit of an idea as to the architecture on this, and you have some resources now that if you want to look at this as you expand your data store infrastructure and your software-defined data store, your software-defined data center to include software-defined storage, you've got some information under your belt now to do that. Okay? Well, this does it here for our module on storage. And we've looked at a lot of different technologies that now bring us shared storage across our ESXi hosts so that our virtual machines have a lot of different capabilities. They have the ability to support host failures in a vSphere HA cluster. We have the ability to do vMotion because multiple ESXi hosts can see the same storage. We can do storage vMotion because our ESXi hosts have the ability to move our virtual machine files across multiple data stores. And we have now the knowledge of the different types of data stores, be it VMFS or virtual volumes or NFS, and we have some idea as to how to choose those and how to implement them in terms of configuration on ESXi. Okay? So when it comes to your own environment, you know, there's some decisions to be made. We have the ability to implement the stuff that we have. We have some things that we can think about now if we want to scale our infrastructure and if we're putting new infrastructure in place. We have some ways to do this. A lot of organizations like Virtual Beans here are going to implement multiple different types of storage architectures. I might have one that's most highly performant for my production. I might have one that's utilized for my backup infrastructure, and so on, right? It's up to you how you want to deploy this. ESXi is there to support you in whatever decisions that you make in terms of your storage infrastructure. So think about now how you might utilize vSAN in particular, because this is new stuff, right? And so have a discussion or think about what some of those advantages might be, especially when it comes to policy-driven storage itself. What are the benefits of vSAN storage? How do I use the vSphere client, which we've now looked at if you've done that lab, okay? We allow our vSphere administrators to take some of that control from the storage side of things, right? Without having to have silos for our storage administrators and our vSphere administrators. Now all of our vSphere administrators can kind of do that job of building the storage in order to accommodate the virtual machines instead of relying on the vSphere administration to build a LUN, or the storage administrators to build a LUN that might accommodate that virtual machine. And then if it should change, if those policies should change, I got to go back to the storage administrators as opposed to just making a policy change. So I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. We've looked at all kinds of different protocols here. We've looked at all of the data stores, of the different types of data stores, and we're going to move on from storage, and we're going to have a look at some of the different things that we can do with our virtual machines once they're in place. So some advanced virtual machine administration, including things like vMotion, cloning, and so on. We'll talk to you real soon in module number 7.